Hello, I'm Dr. James Gilley, and this is American Government. In this module, we're going to be looking at the notion of a constitutional republic and how history shaped and formed the institutions that will make up the government that actually administers the nation that is the United States. So let's go ahead and jump right on in. So, when we left off, what we saw was that we left off with our historical narrative. What we saw was that the Articles of Confederation, the original governance documents of the United States, simply were not functional. They didn't give enough power to the central government. There was a major power gap that had emerged in the United States, under the Articles of Confederation. If you need a reminder of that, go back and look at Shays' Rebellion, which we talked about in the last module. Shays' Rebellion was this difficulty that emerged because the central government of the United States of America didn't have enough authority to raise taxes, to fund its programs. It didn't have enough money to raise a military. It didn't really have any centralized military power whatsoever. So this lack of central authority led to a lot of problems that got dealt with in the creation of our federal system, our constitutional republic. And we're going to get to that a little bit later. But there was also a major issue of each state really putting itself in conflict with all the rest of the states. It was a system essentially of every state against each other. We saw the emergence of internal trade wars. We saw taxation between goods flowing between states. We saw a lot of problems, a lot of central authority problems emerge under these Articles of Confederation. And it was such a weak system that we actually saw the first president of the United States, these United States of America, under the Articles of Confederation, who was, in fact, John Hancock, not George Washington. We saw that these, he didn't even bother to show up for the job. So the Articles of Confederation were fundamentally flawed from their emergence. So in order to address these issues, by the middle end of the 1780s, the politicians of the day came together to attempt to fix the problems of the Constitution. Of these Articles of Confederation, which eventually morphed into a constitutional convention. And the form of government that they end up choosing is something called a constitutional republican democracy. So that's something we need to unpack a little bit, We need to understand what that term means, Because it's kind of a loaded term. It's got a lot going on within it. So let's start from the beginning and work our way back to the front. The first thing we really want to look at here is the notion of what is a democracy. And there's really two big ways of understanding what a democracy is, of looking at a democracy. The first is this notion of a maximalist definition, a definition that's kind of like the kitchen sink, trying to throw everything at our definition here. And this is also known as polyarchy, as created by the great political scientist whose name is Dahl. And what this definition does is it lists every form, everything that goes along with being democracy, So things like an educated population, a well-functioning economy, state capacity, This lists all of the things that go along with being a democracy. And that's one way of looking at things, but it's not necessarily the most useful way, as you can get a lot of debate over whether something is a democracy or isn't a democracy. So we as political scientists like to look at things in kind of a different way, what we call a minimalist definition of democracy. This was This was created by the political scientist by the name of Jaworski. That's that P word up there, Adam Jaworski. And what this view of political of democracy looks like is very simple. It's a system where parties lose elections. So a minimalist definition of a democracy is simply it's a system where parties can actually lose elections. Now this can lead to some interesting results when we're looking at it, but it's a very simple, straightforward definition that we can easily measure, looking at if a party loses elections or not. Now, this can lead to some interesting results, like Japan never really having elected another political party, so it might not necessarily show up as a minimalist democracy, but it's clearly a democracy. But whereas Mexico, when they hadn't elected a new political party in kind of the middle part of the 1900s, at the last century, maybe they were not democratic, and they would both appear as not democratic under this minimalist definition. But because this definition is so consistent, so easily verifiable, this is actually really useful for us. So for our purposes, right, when we're going to talk about a democracy, we're going to talk about a system where parties can actually lose elections. Now, when we're talking about democracy, we can also deal with questions of whether it's direct democracy, right, the people making decisions and voting for themselves, or indirect, where they come up with representatives. And that's where we get to the next term. Right? When you're using a system where you are indirectly selecting, right, indirectly governing yourselves, right? You pick a representative to stand in for you. That makes the system a representative system. And when we're talking about a representative system of democracy, we're talking about a republic, right? So when we're talking about republics, right, when we're talking about representatives, we're dealing with the term republic. So a republican democracy is a democracy where you are electing leaders to make decisions for you. Right? And then, right, stepping one step back further, right, we're talking about constitutions, right? A constitution is simply a set of rules about how you're going to go about making your rules. So if we put all of that together, right, if you have a set of rules that are concerned with how you're going to be making rules, right? And this gives you a little bit of a concern for the rights of the people as well. So you get a constitutional republic. So what the founders of our country made is a constitutional republican democracy. So they created a document that governs how we're going to make our rules. And this is going to be very respectful of rights within this system. Right? And in this system, we, the people, are going to select representatives who are actually going to do the governing for us. So a constitutional republican democracy is what we ended up with. Right? And essentially that is bounded, right? Popular rule within some boundaries. So our actual government system that gets created in the United States is one of these constitutional republican democracies, right? That's what we end up creating here. So when we're thinking about constitutions as a whole, right, let's unpack that term a little bit more. Right, when we're talking about a constitution itself, what we're really dealing with here are rules about how we go about making rules. It's not the rules of the game itself, right? It's not the rules of how we play politics. It's not the rules of how we govern our lives. It's the rules about how we go about playing that game, how we make that system. Right? So these are the rules about making our rules. Now, a constitutional democratic republic can't function without some important things undergirding it. Kind of first and foremost is you need an educated public who can really make decisions, right, informed decisions within this system. So there has to be some large degree of education within this system in order for a constitutional republic to work. You also need to have a fairly well-funded system, right? So there needs to be a decent amount of economic development in order for a constitutional democratic republic to really truly function. And thanks to a lot of research, especially by Adam Jaworski, coming back to him again, we've seen that it's about $4,000 of GDP per capita per year is kind of that magical level of economic development where a constitutional democratic republic can function. Additionally, there needs to be a large degree of openness within society. People have to be willing to deal with differences in order for this to really work, right? Constitutional democratic republics are meant to be very respectful of people's rights and differences in diversity. So society as a whole needs to be kind of accepting of that way of life, right? This openness with each other in order for it to work. Also, everyone kind of has to agree that democracy is the way that they want to be governed, right? You can Right? If people don't buy into this notion of democracy, then it's not going to work. Right? There has to be an agreement, a consensus that democracy is what we're working for here. And there also needs to be a good deal of stability within the system. If the system's constantly overturning, if there's constant change within the system, right, not just change within politics within the system, but actually making constant revisions to how the system works, then that constitutional democratic republic's probably going to break down. But perhaps the most important thing for a constitutional democratic republic to function is a belief in the rule of law, that everyone has to follow the law within the system. No one can be above the law. Even the political leaders have to follow the law, right? The law applies equally to everyone. And that's kind of the core value that really makes a constitutional democratic republic work. And establishing that rule of law is not necessarily an easy thing. It's not a given, right? The population has to learn that everyone is going to be impacted equally by the law, and that's really what makes this system function, right? That is the foundation of a constitutional democratic republic working, is this respect for the rule of law. Now, when we make constitutions, there's a lot of different decisions that we can make. There's a lot of different variables that we can tweak to give us different sorts of impacts within the system. So, listed on this page, right, we see several of these different ways of going about and making our constitutions, right? Different decisions we can make. So, kind of the first decision that needs to be made is how you're going to pick your leaders, right? Now, there's many different ways of doing this democratically, but there's also some non-democratic ways of doing it that could be considered fair, like perhaps election by lottery, right? Some people are talking about possibly instituting that in democratic countries, right? So you get a better representativeness of the people by randomly selecting who's going to run. But for the most part, we've seemed to have agreed that the most fair and just way to do this is to actually have people vote on their leaders in kind of a Republican form. But you can make that choice, right? Democratic or non-democratic leadership selection. There's also choices you can make when making a legislature, right? When building the institution that's going to go about making your laws. The first choice you've got to make there is how many houses are you going to have, right? Most states end up having two, right? States in the sense of both institutions of government, right, through administrative bodies, as well as these states within the United States. Most states have two houses, which we call a bicameral legislature. But you can have one, right? Scotland has a unicameral legislature. Nebraska has a unicameral legislature. So you can just have one. I can't think of any examples of tricameral or quadricameral. So usually the decision's one or two, how many houses you're going to have there. And there's also the idea of how it's going to relate to the other branches of government. Is it going to be separate from all the other branches, particularly the executive branch or the judicial branch, or is it going to be unified in some sort of way? If you look at countries like any country that has a parliament, the executive and legislature are unified. If you look at the United Kingdom prior to 2009, the House of Lords and the judiciary were the same. So there's this idea of separating powers or having them united. There's questions about how do you make a judiciary. Do you build it as a separate, independent body, or do you make it politically dependent? Do you let your judges hear every type of case, or do you specialize them within types of law? Do you have a constitutional court, a business court, etc., etc.? These are big decisions that need to be made. There's also questions about a bureaucracy, right? How strong do you want your bureaucracy to be? And who's responsible for the bureaucracy? Is it tied to the legislature? Is it tied to the executive? Is it kind of an independent body on its own that functions when the rest of the system doesn't? Right? These are decisions you have to make. You also have to make decisions about your banking institutions. Right? Do you want them to be centralized? Right? One big central bank? Do you want distributed banks, a whole bunch of competing banks? Do you want them independent of the political system, or do you want them heavily tied to the political system? These are all viable decisions within a constitutional democratic republic. Even within the boundaries of that constitutional democratic republic, we can see massive variations in whether or not any of these variables matter. So these are all really important things within the political system that our framers had to think about, that anyone building a constitution had to think about. And our particular framers had to think about their own politics and the politics of their nation when building their constitutional republic, when writing our own constitution. So we need to take a look at the politics of the United States circa 1784 to really understand how we ended up with the political system that we have today. So there was a lot of what we call political cleavages or breaks in our political society that existed, that really drove the politics of the day. First and foremost, we saw this kind of north-south divide. The South was much more agrarian, it was much more economically developed, even though it was agrarian. It had a slave-based political economy. In the North, they were much more industrial, smaller states, less population, less well-developed. So there was that divide between the North and the South. There was a divide between people living in the cities and people living rurally. The rural people, there were more of them. They needed more representation. There were really very few cities in the way we understand them today. The way that people made their money, industrial, building things, versus agricultural versus financial. These were different political cleavages that existed at the time. Perhaps the main one was this idea of, did you want to centralize power in a federal system, or would you have an anti-federalist tendency and you wanted to keep power distributed even further than it would end up eventually? And at the core of all this were big states versus small states. So while there was kind of a general alignment between northern urban industrial federalists from small states and southern rural agricultural anti-federalists in big states, there were a lot of cross-cutting cleavages here, You didn't have to completely follow the ticket, There weren't just two institutions. Each one of these was a factor in every individual playing in politics. But generally speaking, what we saw were the emergence of two political groups. The Federalists, pushed by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, John Jay, they were, and really to a large extent also James Madison, said James Madison. What they were advocating for was a much stronger central government, along with central banking institutions, or at least that's what Alexander Hamilton was heavily pushing for. Madison had some disagreements with that. If you'd like to know more, listen to Hamilton, the album, the musical. It does get into, surprisingly, this type of politics. On the other hand, so on the one hand, we had the Federalists writing these papers called the Federalist Papers, arguing for their system of constitutional governance. On the other hand, we had the Anti-Federalists, so Richard Henry Lee, George Mason, Sam Adams, Thomas Jefferson, They argued for a much more decentralized, weak central government. They wanted to decentralize power for everything. They were kind of, not anarchists, but they wanted to radically redistribute power away from the center. They wanted to fight off tyranny. That was their key concern here. They'd fought a revolution to leave a tyrannical system, and they didn't want to create a new one in the United States. So there were these two different political tensions at play here. So once the debate over how to build the political system of the United States occurred, once they realized that the Articles of Confederation were not going to work, they had to create a constitutional convention, which was mildly treasonous, Creating this constitutional convention, it was seeking to overthrow the government of the Articles of Confederation, Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation said this was going to exist in perpetuity, That's how this was going to work. And then they scrapped that after 2 or 3 years. So they were overthrowing the government that they'd already put into place, but it was the same people that had put it into place to begin with. So, it was more like they were just redrafting the system. Now, there were a couple of different plans that emerged about how this Constitution should exist. On one hand, you had the plan that came from the big states, the southern agricultural states, called the Virginia Plan. This was a unicameral system that would represent based on population. This was a system that we wanted to count all people that lived in states as part of the calculation of the number of representatives. It was a unicameral system, right, based solely on population. This would have given a lot of power to big states like Virginia and Georgia and the Carolinas, the southern states. On the other hand, you had the New Jersey Plan, which wanted to represent each state equally, which actually ends up preferencing the smaller states in the system. And New Jersey wanted a system that was much more just kind of like just the Senate. So what we ended up seeing, right, is a compromise emerged from Connecticut, which again was kind of halfway between these two systems. And within this compromise, what we saw were several different things that got added to the Constitution. Right, we ended up with, first off, the South being the capital, Washington D.C. being where, right, the capital was, which was the South. There was the inclusion of a Bill of Rights that would deliberately state the rights of the people. There would be a balance between the states and the central government. This is where federalism was introduced. It would create a bicameral legislature, one that represented the states and one that represented the people. Right, so this was to balance and compromise between them. It created a system where the federal government would regulate interstate commerce to a large degree, and it would also limit the power of the state, right, of the centralized government. It also created the 3/5 compromise, where slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person, which would, right, reduce the population of slave states, but would also still, right, allow for some representation of those people, even though they were considered property. Right, they did not remove slavery in the original version of the Constitution. But they did limit the power of the centralized government. Right, if it was not a power that was granted by the Constitution, then it was a power reserved for the states or for the people. They also put into place an intervening institution between popular election of the president. Right, they created the Electoral College to deliberately separate, right, create a gap between popular election and the office of the presidency. So this whole system becomes predicated on checks and balances between the various branches of the government and keeping power as separated as possible. And this is something we're to come back and spend 3 modules on after the midterm, right? Just how this checks and balances and separation of powers truly works in the American system by looking at the institutions of government. We already did that one. Okay. So what we end up with is a constitution that is very heavily focused on federalism, right? Of distributing power, of keeping it divided between the states and keeping it divided within the federal government itself. So this notion of a constitutional democratic republic is really at the center of how our system functions. And this system itself functions based on the powers of federalism, which we talked about in a previous, in a different module. So each institution of government is given the ability to check other institutions of government, right? It's kind of like rock, paper, scissors for the institutions within our government. Right, so we have a judiciary that's able to check the actions of the executive and the laws created by the legislature. We've created a legislature that can pass laws and, right, override actions of the president. The president can override laws created by the legislature and enact the laws that the legislature creates. Right, this whole system is predicated on separating powers of the people themselves, selecting how they're going to be governed, right, by electing representatives who do the governing. And of course, they are in fact bounded by the rules of the Constitution. So that's, right, at the core of how this American system works. So from this point on, right, you need to do your reading, check out the quiz, do the assignment, right? Make sure you get through these sorts of things. When we come back, our next module, we're going to kind of take this a step further, right, digging a little bit deeper. So I hope you all have a great day, and thank you, and goodbye.